My name's Sam Brody. I teach in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Kansas. I research modern Jewish thought on philosophy, politics, and economics, and I wrote a book about Martin Buber that I guess we're going to talk about today.
I think we are. What is the name of your book on Martin Buber?
That book is entitled Martin Buber's Theopolitics.
Okay, so I'm sure you are deeply, wildly, intimately familiar with Buber. If somebody comes up to you at a cocktail party, or you're in an elevator, or you got to give the pitch, what's your elevator pitch to people who don't know who Martin Buber is and why, how he's important?
I would say Martin Buber was a Jewish philosopher who lived mostly in Germany and then in pre-state Palestine and then Israel. So his life spanned the Imperial German, Weimar German, and Nazi German eras, and then he lived in British Mandate Palestine and the State of Israel. So, all of his thought occurred at one of the most dramatic and turbulent moments in Jewish history. And out of that moment, he developed a lot of interesting thought. What he's most well known for is what's called a philosophy of dialogue. It's really a thinking about relationships between beings. But what I wrote about is his concept of theopolitics, which is a bit lesser known and shows up mainly in his biblical commentaries, which he also wrote. His philosophy is very general audience oriented, and some people have even asked whether there's anything Jewish about it. But then on the other hand, he has all of these commentaries on the Tanakh and on other Jewish sources, which dovetail with the philosophy in interesting ways. So that's what I chose to write about.
Do you think his intent, or maybe you're clear having looked at his correspondence or things he's written himself, was his intent to write for a general non-Jewish audience in these smaller cases?
I think it was. Even his very first books, which were anthologies of Hasidic tales that he sort of rewrote in a kind of German neo-romantic literary style, were aimed at general audiences. He wanted to put Jewish thought into a dialogue with all of these other sources of wisdom that, whatever the 19 teens German equivalent of a hippie was, they were getting really into mysticism. They were really into Eastern traditions, and Buber indulged in a little bit of self-orientalizing by trying to bring Hasidic Jewish sources into conversations that were already being had by people like that.
Is this well before there was sort of a making academic or a professionalizing of the idea of religious studies or comparative religion? So is this well before that time?
It's actually right there at the beginning of that time. And, some scholars today would even argue comparative religion has served many purposes, right? It was initially developed, arguably, by Jesuit missionaries who mainly used it to highlight the superiority of Catholic Christianity, but in many cases they were also deeply interested in the traditions they were studying and had some scholarly rectitude and were concerned with representing those traditions accurately, even if their ultimate goals were polemical in nature. But at the moment, in the time and place that Buber was writing, and for the audience he was writing for, there was a somewhat slightly different goal, which was to attempt to neutralize religious conflict by demonstrating the inner similarity of all religions. And the concept of mysticism arguably developed primarily to serve that purpose. It presents as a scholarly category, as a scientific category, but the very idea of mysticism exists so that you can say there's Jewish mysticism, there's Christian mysticism, there's Islamic mysticism, etc., etc. And at the time, it was very clear and argued explicitly that when you get right down to it, they all say the same thing. Just in their separate languages and in their different traditions and their different ways. Sort of like people tending to be more on the liberal side will do when they talk about the golden rule or when they talk about ethics, of traditions like to play down the idea that religions have actual differences over these questions and emphasize baseline commonalities. And the purpose of doing that is to essentially avoid conflict. So, yeah.
Okay, this is fascinating because, again, in your book title, Theopolitics, so just looking at that as a 21st century person, it's a beautiful term, but I wonder when people talk about theopolitics as referencing the state of Israel, there's a lot of sense that there's a lot of God-seeking people there, and they're all fighting. The Muslims and the Christians and the Jews are all fighting over this terrain because of their gods, and that's what's causing the problem. So I'm curious, what does this term theopolitics mean? And would moderns look at this all again? Would the initial take on it be, oh yeah, that's the problem with Israel in that region, all the theopolitics? What does that mean?
Yeah. So Buber uses the term theopolitics. He uses it in German, Theopolitik. He uses it in Hebrew, Theopolitica. And every time he uses it, I believe, and I'm following other scholars who have argued this before me, that he is specifically attempting to reverse or invert a term that was prevalent in Weimar Germany called political theology. I think that what most people who might have the reaction you're talking about are reacting to is what Buber would have called political theology. The political theology, there's a lot more to it, but essentially what it does is, and this is, it might sound like they mean the same thing, but why in one the politics comes first and in the other God comes first, right? So political theology is when you essentially attempt to bolster some form of human rule by claiming that it has divine sanction. So basically you have your preferences and you want your preferences to win, so you say God is on my side and I get to kill you or put you in prison or whatever I want to do, which, from the perspective of many religious critics throughout history is one of the most persistent and painful and devastating forms of idolatry there is, right? That's what taking the Lord's name in vain really is taking what you want and slapping a God label on it so that you can oppress someone else. So in terms of what is the opposite of political theology, right? One opposite could be the liberal separation of religion and politics, which essentially is one way of attempting to get out of this problem. So you go back to the 17th century, you read John Locke on toleration or whatever, or you read Thomas Jefferson, and what they will say is something like, or you even go to the 18th century, and read Moses Mendelssohn, right? What they will say is, it is foolish and tyrannical for governments to require adherence to a particular religion because you can't actually control what people believe. So all you're going to do if you have a religious requirement is you're going to turn people into hypocrites and liars, and you're not actually going to spread belief. So if you really care about belief, there's a certain Protestant kind of inflection to this argument because it's very inward. It focuses on what's going on inside you. But the premise is basically if you really care about belief, that's not your strategy. And if you care about freedom, that's not your strategy. So liberalism attempts to solve the question by just separating politics and religion and turning religion into a private thing. Yep. Buber didn't think that Judaism could accommodate that. With all due respect to Mendelssohn, he thought that it was clear from the beginning that Judaism intended to provide or offer a sort of total way of life where your behavior is integrated and all in obedience to the covenant. And so you can't just sort of carve out a specific part of life where you say God's not in charge over here and God is in charge over here. However, how do you do that when it's very clear that the people who usually talk about that are mainly just interested in imposing whatever it is that they personally want you to do? And his answer,
political theologian,
right? And his answer, he basically found the period of ancient Israelite living described in the first half of the book of Judges, prior to the monarchy. And he interpreted that as the true theocracy, right? Theocracy means rule of God, not rule of some people that say that they tell you what God wants. It means the direct rule of God. So if you're going to have the direct rule of God, then you basically can't have a human authority structure at all, which means you don't have to worry about imposing your coercive interpretation of God's law on people. So it basically looks like anarchism, except that you think that you're in a monarchy, but the monarchy is invisible.
Okay, so he goes all the way back to that period, the famous story in Tanakh, which says the people come clamoring to the prophet, we need a king. And the prophet says, bad news, you don't want a king. Kings are terrible. We want a king. Okay, you get a king. So, and again, the Tanakh seeming to say, a king's not a great idea.
So that's the end of the story that he tells, right?
Okay, that's the end.
That's the end because God ends up in that story telling Samuel, okay, after you warn them, give them what they want. Give them the king. Warn them what the king will do, and then give them the king. So his sort of hero in the version of the story that he tells in his book, The Kingship of God, is earlier than that in the book of Judges, when Gideon, the victorious general, rescues the people from oppression, and then they come to him and say, be our king and rule over us, you and your sons after you. And Gideon responds, I will not rule over you, and my sons will not rule over you, only God will rule over you. And so for Buber, that is the banner of the true theocracy.
And does he call it anarchy and anarchism?
He compares it to anarchism in several places, usually to distinguish it because, as he understands it, anarchism means there's no one in charge. And he really wants to emphasize that in this conception, God is in charge. You are living under a rule. It's just not a human rule. And so it's a very fine line, right? Because there's clearly this desire that shows up in both the Gideon story and the Samuel story, where people want the human ruler. They want that intermediary to come in between them and God and represent God to them. And for Buber, this is no different than the golden calf, which is also an intermediary that's supposed to represent God to the people, right? The problem of idolatry in the golden calf story and elsewhere is not accidentally worshiping the wrong God. It's worshiping God in some sort of represented form that is like too solid, that prevents God from moving. Buber thinks that the whole point of the wandering stories, the idea of the Mishkan, everything prior to the temple, which is of course built by the human king, is that God is mobile. God moves. God says, I will be what I will be is my name. And so idolatry is anytime you freeze that into a single representation and you say, this is your God, O Israel, whether it's the golden calf or whether it's the house of David.
Okay, then I'm fascinated because, again, so the ad copy on your book makes this bold claim. Buber's anarchist reading of the Bible, which now makes a little sense to me, and his ideas about God had an effect on early Zionists and its opponents. So what you're talking about, God is to govern our life, that sounds like the Haredim, people who are in opposition to the state of Israel, or certainly not happy with secular winning over religion.
Sure.
But then also this anarchy, socialism, communism, this is like stuff that's like flushing God out. And there's this beautiful utopia we can build without the God, which causes a problem. This sounds like it's all just horribly mixed together in Buber's thing. So who does he wind up influencing, and who winds up supporting him or opposing him?
So obviously, he's not orthodox. When he talks about obeying God's commandments, he doesn't mean the 613 commandments, the Mishnah Torah, or the Shulchan Aruch. And that's where his philosophy comes in. Right, because he thinks that obeying the commandments or following God's command essentially means confronting the situation and listening the way that you would in a dialogue with a person, and then attempting to hear in the situation what God demands of you. Almost like sort of a Quaker kind of inner light type idea. And when you hear that command, you respond to it. But even then, there's a danger, which is that you forget to go back and listen again, so that you extend the moment too far, and then you keep following that command when the moment has changed, and so then you've already frozen it too much. So you need to make a constant practice of this. And so that's basically what he means when he says follow the command, right? He really means conscience, except that he doesn't want you to think that the conscience is yours and belongs to you, right? He wants you to think that you are in dialogue with the situation, which is outside of you, and that the command is coming also from outside of you because of the posture of listening that you assume. So you don't just think, here's what I want. You stop and you try to really see. So in that sense, the Haredim who are opposed to Zionism are not a terrible comparison, because they think they know what God wants and it's not this, so they reject it and they oppose it. But Buber thought that what made him a Zionist was that he thought that the command that the Jewish way of life required that Jews essentially come together in sufficient concentration that they be able to enact their way of life in some way rather than being oppressed or suppressed by some other population. There needed to be, at minimum, autonomy for Jews to do Judaism. But he did not think that the European nation state was like a good model for autonomy. He thought it was a bad model. And he thought the state in general was a pretty bad model. So that's why when he thought about what would this look like in the present, right? Because we don't have the 12 tribes anymore. We don't live in semi-nomadic clans, each of which has a chieftain. So he thought that the kibbutz movement represented a certain kind of incarnation in the present of the kind of thing he was looking for. And of course he knew that the kibbutzniks were pretty much all radical secularists, right? And of course the ones who weren't radical secularists were Orthodox. They weren't Buber people. So the secularists came and listened to him because often they were Buber people, and they just thought, okay, we're going to listen to him, translate it into our own language so that we like it, and then we can try and do what he says. And the Orthodox weren't listening to him, but they were attempting to do what he wanted, which was unify Judaism and socialism, and really an anarchist socialism, because they were self-governing communities that did not necessarily, in his version, right, in his version of the project, the telos of the kibbutz did not have to be the state. Obviously, in the Ben-Gurion version, the point is the Mapai and the Histadrut use all of the kibbutzim to unify their power and eventually create a sort of para-state apparatus that becomes a state. But in the sort of Buber version, as I understand it, it's enough. Having a bunch of small self-governing communities that are sort of networked together and can make collective decisions about production if they have to, and can visit each other and take inspiration from each other and create a culture. That was enough. So he thought it was a big mistake to declare openly or privately that the goal was to create a Jewish majority in the space so that you could control the state that would emerge there, because he didn't think... He was opposed to both aspects of that. On the one hand, the majority only matters so you control the state. And he didn't think you needed the state. So what's the point of having a majority? Just many. Many is good. Who cares if you have a majority? If you have many, then you can do what he thought needed to be done. But the Zionist movement was always... The mainstream always thought in terms of the state, and it always thought in terms of creating a Jewish majority in the territory. When I say always, I'm overdrawing a little bit, right? Because during the Ottoman period, they didn't really think in terms of sovereignty. They didn't imagine before World War I that the Ottoman Empire would just disappear and that there would be even a chance for a sovereign state. Then the British were there, and they talked in terms of commonwealth. So, like, I'm overdrawing it a little bit, but you get the idea.
And I want to wander into the Jewish majority, but before I do, I want to go back to you present. So it is beautiful. You talked about this. I think what he's describing is a mystical experience. I am listening for God, and I regularly listen for God. I mean, you can call, but the mystical experience is not for most people. So even if, like, I can imagine these kibbutzniks going to Buber and they're like, this stuff sounds great, but the average person doesn't have a mystical relationship with the divine, and they don't normally sit down and try to listen for the still small voice inside. So then I'm like, the theopolitics, then I'm like worried Buber's whole thing, and you don't have to evaluate it judgmentally. It just sounds like another utopian idea that has not played out before and shall not play out in the future. How do you look at that?
Well, he thought that realism, what most people considered realism, was utopian. And the example that I will give there is the great text of Zionist realism, Vladimir Jabotinsky's Iron Wall. Right? Jabotinsky said, in a sort of searing critique of the Ben Gurion faction, right? You're all pretending that the Arabs here aren't going to oppose you. You're all acting like they think they're going to benefit from our coming here. Never in the history of the world has there been a colonial movement that just was welcomed by the people, who lived in the place that they were moving to. You should expect armed resistance, and the only way that we're going to win is to create ourselves like a sort of a fortress that is undefeatable, and one day they'll give up, right? And that's considered the realistic position. And, to that sort of realism, Buber's response would be like, oh, they're going to give up? When are they going to give up? And, he's been dead now for over 50 years. They haven't given up. So how is that realism? Right? It's in itself, it's a utopia. It anticipates that through force, you can establish not just your physical safety, but somehow your legitimacy and your security in a deeper sense. And so he thought that was utopian. So whereas his thing, he always was, and much like Herzl himself, right, in the Jewish state, Herzl is the way that he attempts to counter the charge of utopianism, which would have been very fair to level at him in 1897, was to point to other instances of colonial projects being funded by private donors and building settlements and so on like that. And he said, look, this has happened before. There's no reason it can't happen in this case. And so what Buber does is he points to things that are actually going on, like the kibbutz. And he says, look, here it is. Here's an example of what I want. This is it. It exists. And he would pretty much always do that. Now, with respect to the mystical experience aspect, here is where I think the philosophy part is important, which I don't get into that much in the theopolitics discussions because I think it's less talked about and it needs to be brought to the fore more. But the early Buber is very into mystical experience as a kind of thing on its own. You go on a retreat, you go up to the top of a mountain and you meditate, whatever it is, right? But part of what I think attracts him in Hasidism is the way that, at least as he interprets it, and Sholem famously disagreed with this, and they had this whole debate about the true nature of Hasidism or whatever. But in Buber's interpretation, Hasidism is all about hallowing worldliness. So in the course of your ordinary life, not in some kind of specialty life, not in the life of a religious professional who is some sort of virtuoso, but in the course of your ordinary life, you are able to see what is sacred. And the Hasidic virtuoso, the Jewish version of this religious special guy, is like the person who is able to do that all the time in a normal interaction. So I think that he carries that over into the Theopolitics too. So even if what you're doing is you're at a meeting and like all the people in your community are arguing about what should they do. If your mind is able to recall itself to the idea in the heat of that moment, the idea that you're commanded, and if you just like let's say two of your friends, your colleagues are getting in a very heated argument at some kind of meeting about, how should my synagogue spend its money, or how should our town respond to this law that the state just passed, or something like that. And you jump in and you say, hey, let's stop insulting each other here. Let's remember what's important. That could be an example of like what he's talking about. The ability to redirect towards what's truly important because you remember your role. Now, does that always happen? No. But it's not as out of reach as like everybody turning into a saint or something. It's something that you can imagine being developed by an intentional practice of like trying to have good habits instead of crappy habits. So in that sense, I think it's like a little bit less far away. It's like in Deuteronomy, it is not in heaven. It is in your mouth. It is very near to you to do it.
So having a good habit versus having a dirty habit, again, really putting it in the standard muck, boots on the ground example of, this is a better habit to communicate. This is a better way to communicate, but it's hard to do and you're not used to it. Your emotions get the better of you. And I feel like all these religions and philosophies play with this idea of putting yourself in whatever mindset you're supposed to be so you can act with wisdom. Does Buber have anything to say about the fact that people don't do this? So then again, if I threw back all your stuff about his argument that the realpolitik is the utopia, because this doesn't play out. Violence begets more violence, and this is never going to work. You can't build a fortress that is unassailable. It has never happened in all of history. It's never going to happen. Things are going to fall apart. So, but again, so he's right, but to push the utopia back on him, then how come this doesn't happen? Then how come this doesn't win? How come we have all these nation states and they're all political theology? They're playing with political theology instead of theopolitics.
Right. I mean, I think Buber's answer to that is that's what Judaism is about. Like the fact that we have freedom, and we can choose life or we can choose death. And it seems like from the very beginning, we are placed in that position of absolute freedom to make that decision. And I think the way that he reads Tanakh is like the story of how sometimes we chose life and sometimes we chose death. And I don't think that he has he constantly, even though he is a socialist, he is not a Marxian socialist, and the main reason that he's not is because he perceives that to be a Marxist socialist, you have to believe in what Marx called laws of history. And he basically doesn't believe in laws of history, or at least in most of his writing, I would say. There are moments here or there where maybe he wants to, but most of the time he sees us all in the position of being addressed by the prophet and being told to choose life and not death. And throughout history, we're always just equally in that position. We're not progressing more and more towards being less in that position. So all humans are the same in every generation. That actually is an argument that was made by Mendelssohn against Kant, who, well before Marx also tried to argue that history had progressed, and that was an underpinning of 19th century thought, liberal, right-wing, left-wing. Everybody believed that history was on the march. And he didn't think that was true. But what he did think was that to be Jewish meant that you believed God. When God said, if you choose life, you will experience blessing. And therefore to believe that is possible to do, even though you also have the possibility of choosing death. So there's just like no escape from freedom, basically.
Okay, now I want to talk about, you mentioned earlier, this issue with, again, generating the Jewish majority. So how do you do that? How did it happen? And so I think the argument the book is probably making, and you're probably making, is that this thing Buber talked about before, during, and after the establishment of the modern nation state of Israel, there were decisions that got made that probably went the wrong way in how to deal with the fact that there are people here who are not like us. So how do we generate this? So did he have thoughts about how do you get, there's a lot of people here that aren't like us and they don't want to follow our theo. They have a different thing. How does he suggest that could have been dealt with?
So what he thought was that, and in this sense, there are some commonalities between him and what we would call a religious Zionist today, although that has a inherently right-wing connotation. Yeah. And one of those similarities is that he believed the Zionist movement to be engaged in some way in the project of creating our third commonwealth, right? And therefore it should be spoken of in the same breath as the first one and the second one, as opposed to like the Satmar who say, oh, a bunch of heretics are doing some heresy, right? Like, that is not his take, but what he thinks is that in each case, right, in the case of the original conquest of the land, and in the case of the return from exile, in each case, there are different obstacles that are placed in the way of being able to follow the covenant easily, and those are the tests that the people have to face in order to meet the demand that God places on them. And so his first approach to this question is, in this time, the fact that the Jews will be a small minority in this land and that other people have lived here for 1,400 years or more is that test, right? And the only way to meet that cannot be to redo the conquest like in Joshua, or to promulgate the Torah under the auspices of the empire that's there, like in the Persian period, which led to the creation of this priestly state. It has to be a new project. And so one of the things that he thought was an advantage of cultural Zionism, which he signed on to fairly early on, he helped Herzl run his newspaper for a couple years, but then by the time of the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1902, Buber was in the Democratic faction with Chaim Weizmann, and he was more of an Echad Ha'am guy, but like he eventually all these people go in different directions, right? But
okay.
Well, basically the advantage that he thought that cultural Zionism had was, if you're only self-selecting for people who are highly ideologically committed to the project, you're not creating a threatening population that's going to cause a reaction from the Palestinian Arabs, and you will have time to establish relationships of trust and mutual aid and dialogue that will make it less threatening when the population increases. He did not anticipate, for example, that in the 1930s there would suddenly be mass migrations because of the creation of Jewish refugees in various places. I think he always thought originally that it was going to be... And that is how it looked in the 1890s and the 1900s. Like, just as many people left Palestine as moved there. It was a very tough project. It did not seem like the wave of the future. The only people who did it were the people who were super, hyper, ultra committed. So, like, it wasn't just, like, your best bet if you were trying to have a nice life. And then later, when you create a situation where you have a lot of oppressed refugees that just need to get out of where they are, a lot of, like, random shopkeepers from Munich or wherever plop down in Tel Aviv, and now the population is very different, right? That wasn't really... that didn't fit with Buber's project, whereas it did fit very much with, like, the Ben-Gurion project. Ben-Gurion, if Jews are oppressed somewhere and get kicked out, he's like, oh no, that's so sad. But then he's, like, also very happy that they're popping up in Palestine and increasing the Jewish population.
They have to come here.
Right, so that's a sort of historical, tragic aspect of the situation, is that there wasn't really time for Buber to try to even argue that people should do it his way, right? Between the start of the British Mandate and Hitler coming to power is 12 years or so. Whereas I think his imagination was like a much more longer term kind of situation. And so his basic view is, look, anybody, I mean, in some sense, Jabotinsky is right. If you declare my intention is to come here, outnumber you, and control the territory, then anybody would resist that. But if you say, we want to come here because we believe that this is our sacred land, and we have a project here of obeying God, and we're going to work alongside you to, make a nice place to live, then like he thought maybe there would be a chance of avoiding resistance. Now, obviously, even that version of the project would encounter skepticism and resistance, right? But his hope was, if you can actually build relationships, which takes a long time, and you establish trust, maybe you'll get some local allies who will, help you. And things just move too fast for that, right? Like the Palestinians that knew that he existed, or that Judah Magnus existed, or the other binationalists, they would say, okay, well, that's very nice, but we can see that you're not in charge of this movement. So, like, we don't really have to talk to you. Like, the other people who are saying they're going to conquer us are the ones who are running things, and they're the ones we're going to react to, right? So it was the sort of mirror image of the no partner discourse that you hear on the Israeli side today. Like, if somebody tried to say, look, there are these wonderful Jewish moderates who don't want to conquer the country and just want to live here with you on equal terms, they would say, that's great, but none of the other Zionists are listening to them, so why should we listen to them?
So this is the part, it was reading many years ago, reading Achad Ha'am stuff and be like, oh, this is my kind of Zionism. And he's got that famous, I don't know if it's apocryphal, I'd have to go dig it up, but it's that one that says, if we have to establish our nation here by kicking people who live here out, we ought not to have this whole thing at all. Mm-hmm. Which struck me as like, I thought the whole idea of Judaism was holding the Jews themselves, holding themselves to a higher standard. And that is not easy, and that's terrible, and that comes with sacrifices and costs. So when you're telling me all the stuff Buber's saying, I'm like, great empathy for this, and now it just makes me sad. So is it just sad that this didn't work out, and now here we are?
I mean, the thing about tragedy, I think, is that Buber basically thought that it was inimical to the prophetic worldview. So basically, his position was that God has put this demand down, and in many ways, it can be too late to do certain things, but the direction is always there. That's why we call repentance shuva, turning, because you just, even if you don't move in the direction yet, the first step is you turn and you face the right direction, right? And so in that sense, he would not concede that it's ever really actually purely too late, right? And so I think sometimes that if he were around today, of course he would not be sympathetic to calls for the violent destruction of Israeli life. He would not be sympathetic to movements that commit violence that don't distinguish between soldiers and civilians. But he might be sympathetic to what are sometimes called decolonization projects if they are based on mutual trust and relationship building and nonviolence. Like, I think he would probably support the organization Standing Together, which is a Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian organization that is working to, try and resolve things in ways that provide for shared existence for everybody in the future. So I think there are, certain things that are irreversible. You can't go back and make it possible for things to have gone one way instead of another way. But I think that he would want to look around and see who is doing things in the spirit that he advocated and support those efforts to move to, again, just turn, face the right direction, and start going, no matter how far back on the path you've been pushed. You have to keep trying to go back on it.
Does that hope that absolutely comes out of the Jewish Bible? There's so much in the, again, you've gone the wrong way. Terrible things are going to happen. Everything's wrecked. You've ruined it. It's broken. But don't worry, because God's always there.
Yep.
Things will get better if you turn back. Is that hope permeate everything he does? Did he ever have a period where like, wow, I'm giving up. This is the worst?
Yeah, I think there are moments of, he has, the teaching is a counsel against despair. But I think that he's also a human being, and there are definitely moments in his writing where it seems like despair creeps in, or cynicism creeps in. I mean, if you read the piece he wrote in 1948 at the moment of the War of Independence, called Zionism and quote unquote Zionism, there are some statements in there that really make it seem like he's really in anguish at the death of his project. Like, he can see that the statists are going to win, that they have won, that what he wanted is now impossible, or at least closed off for the foreseeable future, and he's in a little bit of despair about that. But he comes back a couple years later, 1951, and he's like, okay, well, now what? Well, we just have to work from where we are. So, I think there are definitely moments of that, but they don't become the controlling mood.
Do you find yourself on either a personal or looking at these things academically or philosophically, do you fall on Buber's kind of saying we should all be theologically minded. Maybe in a way, is he arguing that theologians or like philosophers should be in charge? Is the problem that does he ever talk about the problem that the people who wind up in positions of politics and governing are usually not the theologians, and they're not the philosophers, and they're not the mystics or the people who have the closest connection to God?
I don't think that he thinks that anybody is particularly special, or has special aptitude for being in charge. I think this is why I think the term anarchist is applicable. I think he thinks that being in charge is the problem. The position of being in charge is going to make the problem, and whoever takes that position will become the problem. So it doesn't really matter what they were before. Which is why I think when he talks about judges, for example, he highlights the fact that these judges are temporary. They get called to do a specific task, and then when the task is over, that's it. They're done. They don't create dynasties. Their sons don't become judges after them, and they don't even become sort of general rulers. Like if their purpose was to defeat the Philistines, they defeat the Philistines and then they go home. So like this is an anarchist argument, right? Like there's expertise, there is skill, right? The Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin famously said, "In matters of shoes, I defer to the shoemaker," right? But like that doesn't mean that the shoemaker should tell me what to do in the rest of my life. I mean, it's like the problem with the tech oligarchs right now. They think that because they're good at coding or because they're good at business, they should run the whole country. And it's like, no, you have one skill. Stick to your skill, which I personally don't even find that impressive. But like, do your one thing you're good at and stop telling me what to do in the rest of my life.
What does it mean that all the way in the ancient stories, encoded in Jewish history and Jewish literature, is this tendency that people want a leader? So they just demand a leader and then they get one. And so these moments when people are able to live, as you said, like the judges, where you have these ephemeral leaders who come up for a time. My favorite, again, the story of George Washington, why he decided not to, but he's like, I'm not staying, I'm out. Okay, this thing's supposed to rotate. Nobody's supposed to sit here on top. We're supposed to be trying to balance these things, and there's all kinds of problems with the founding of America, and why were they doing what they were doing? Why were they establishing that power politics? But this idea of the leader who says, there's a problem with being a leader, but human beings just want leaders, and then they want nation states that they are promised will exist forever. We just want this. We want stability, and the people come and promise it to us. How can the countervailing force against that is It's got so much to push against.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think my answer is the same answer I sort of gave already when I talked about like that he thinks this is the core of Judaism. So the idea of the kingship of God is like no human can occupy this position of leadership. To be conscious of God's kingship is to be conscious that only God can actually fill that role. And to, in a sense, to want the human to fill that role is, first of all, to commit idolatry. But second of all, there's another aspect of it, which I haven't mentioned maybe, and that'll be a good way to make this answer a little different.
Sure.
He talks about fear, right? They ask for the king when they're afraid. And this question of fear is always tied up with this desire for human authority, right? And this is where I think there is a kind of at least a rhetorical connection between Buber and the Satmar again, right? Because the Haredi claim is, if you are that afraid, you don't trust in God, right? Like, God has made us all of these promises. You are faithless if you don't believe him, right? But in moments of fear, it's hard to take that seriously. And a big part of Zionism, which was a secular movement, and the religious Zionists, I think, have never really confronted this intellectually to anyone's satisfaction. But a big part of Zionism is saying, yeah, we don't trust this. Like, this world has beaten us up so much that it's time to take control and take charge of protecting ourselves, you know? And they will go back and use that lens to read all of Jewish history. So, for example, if you read Ruth Weiss's book, Jews in Power, like, she says, you know, the rabbis are wrong. The Second Temple didn't collapse because of Sinat Chinam. It was destroyed because the Romans had a bigger army than we did, right? So there's something fundamentally anti-Jewish about this reading. It is a faithless interpretation of history. But that is not to say that you have to take it in the supernaturalist way, right? Which is the way that the Satmar understand it. Like, even Chabad, who are, pro-Israel in their actions, if not their theology, when the war started, what do? They say, help the Jewish people by putting on tefillin, right? And, like, the strong implication, and you could argue for a sort of materialist reading of it, but I don't think they have that. The strong implication is that this is like a magical practice. You put on the tefillin, and the Israeli soldiers will be more safe because God will be happy that you put on the tefillin and will protect them more, right? Whereas I think what Buber would do with this teaching is say, don't allow your fear to lead you in the direction of idolatry. Remember that is one of the major contributors to this, and recenter yourself and relocate yourself as someone who is a subject of God, the divine king who has made these promises. And that will check your fear, and it will prevent you from despairing, and it will prevent you from idolatry.
Okay, I want to ask you a general question about your book,
Sure.
And then a final question about you. The general question, I'm curious about recommendations. If somebody has never read about Buber before, should they go and read Buber's Theopolitics? Or you're like, no, don't start there. Read this and then this. Or can they just go straight to your book?
I would not say my book is the introductory book to Buber. I like to think that it's not written in an inaccessible way, and that ordinary people who are not, professionally distorted by years of PhD study can read it. I would say start with reading Buber himself. Read his lectures on Judaism, for example. Read his I Am Thou, which is his most famous book and is still widely available 100 years after it was published in a very cheap paperback. Read his anthologies of Hasidic stories. And then I would recommend after that, probably my late advisor, Paul Mendes Flora, Alav Shalom, wrote a biography of Buber that just came out a few years ago, called Martin Buber, A Life of Faith and Dissent. And that would be a good place to go to learn some more. And then there's a nice little bibliography in the back of that, right? And then you can follow the trails. Then after that, you can read my book.
Okay, perfect. As the capstone. When you work all this, work your way up to the capstone. how did you get into Buber, and how did you get? There are many paths to take to study religion or be involved in religion.
Mm-hmm.
What was the call of Buber and the call of religious studies in the decades of your life?
So it's not that interesting of a story, but I was in college. I was a political and social thought major and a Middle East studies major, which was pretty common for people who were freshmen when 9/11 happened. So, I went in taking political theory classes and econ classes, and 9/11 happened, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do Middle East studies too.
Did you think you're going to work for the government? What were you going to do?
Well, I don't know. I took classes I wanted to take, and I wasn't really thinking about professional life. And I took Israel-Palestine classes a lot too. I learned the history of Zionism stuff. I wrote papers on that. And I came to think, I'm missing the religion component. I'm going to take some religion classes. I didn't do that till my third and fourth years of college, so it was too late to add another major. So then I thought, okay, I'm going to do a master's. I mean, it was, I went to the Jewish Theological Seminary just to do Jewish sources, basically, just to do Mishnah and Talmud and other sources, because I didn't have that in my sort of standard Hebrew school education.
Right.
And I guess I thought that religion was the main approaches to what are thought of as religious conflicts from the political science side always assume religion is the problem. Like, it doesn't matter if it's Northern Ireland or if it's Bosnia or if it's Israel-Palestine. They always start from the assumption that if you make it about religion, you're making it an irreconcilable problem. And my professors in college didn't think that was a good approach. And so I was already sort of geared towards having a more open approach to religion at that point. The idea that religion can be a resource for peacemaking and not just for war. The idea that religion can sustain things and not just destroy them. I think that was already sort of there in how I learned things in college, and it made me dissatisfied with the sort of standard poli-sci approach.
And is there a particular was there a particular call that Martin Buber had upon you when you read Buber and you're like, I'm going to work on that? Or was like, it seems like a fertile field, or I like that book enough?
Well, actually, yeah. I mean, so when I was doing this, maybe around my senior year of college, the Second Intifada broke out. And I went with a Palestinian American friend of mine. We applied for some fellowships together. Very cynical. We knew everybody would give us the fellowships if, we did a Jewish Palestinian application. Nice. And we were right. We got 4 or 5 fellowships. So we went to Jerusalem for the summer, and we interviewed a lot of people. And it was remarkably easy, it's such a small country. And it looms so large in the global news and stuff. But we got there at the beginning of the summer. We wrote to all these people and said, hi, we'll be here for the next 8 weeks. Do you have any time in the next 8 weeks to talk to us? And Aleph Bet Yehoshua talked to us, and Benny Morris talked to us, Hanan Ashrawi talked to us. All these famous people just sat down and talked to us. And I read Mendes Floor's other collection of Buber's editorials on Zionism. It's called A Land of Two Peoples. And it basically just collects his short, newspaper editorials and very tiny little essays or lectures he gave to conferences starting around 1917 and going up to the 60s. And that book, I guess that's, to your recommendation question, I would recommend everybody read that book. Because that book, to me, shows how, at least as I read it, he's constantly being accused of utopianism throughout these decades, and everything he's warning about constantly happens. And so it really, just the fact that you go through this chronological progression where he says in 1925, if you don't listen to me, this will happen. And then the 1929 riots break out. And then, he says in 1941, if you don't listen to me, this will happen. And then, there's another war. And so that really sort of persuaded me that I should look into Buber more. And so when I was in grad school, after I did the sources and the sort of rabbinic stuff at JTS, when I got to grad school and I got the German under my belt, I went back and looked at Buber again and developed the dissertation out of like my already existing undergrad interest.
Do you get a lot more out of Buber having German under your belt? Because obviously you read it all in translation before. Is it a special thing? Is it like Hebrew, where you dig into Hebrew and you're like, oh, this stuff completely opens up?
It is. But, the writing in German, it's funny. I feel that when you read secondary literature on Buber, it has a problem, which is that all of the people who write about him start to write like him. Like, everybody starts writing these long Germanic sentences that go on and on and on, and have all these impressions sandwiched in the middle of them instead of just saying what they mean. And so I had to struggle against that myself, I think, because he's a very powerful writer, and you don't want to just...
So all these people who are not Buber start writing like Buber, and it doesn't come out quite as good.
Exactly. And even with him, sometimes it works and sometimes it's annoying. So you have to sometimes the translators do you a favor when they chop the sentences up and they put periods in it, and you go back and you look and you say, oh, I see why they did that. They turned this horrible page-long sentence into 5 sentences. That was the smart thing to do.
And the very last question, has the encounter with Buber you've had academically and philosophically, has it affected your religious feelings, your connection to Judaism, your connection to the Jewish God?
I would say yes. I think that there are a lot of people who share my sort of political leanings, who, when they see other Jews doing things that they find atrocious and undefensible, it makes them question Judaism. It makes them think, how can I continue to be a part of this? And for better or for worse, I simply do not have that reaction. I've never had that reaction. And part of the reason is that I feel very secure and confident in the form of Judaism that I take to inherit from Buber and all his influences and some of his interpreters as well. But I've never felt I have to give up this whole tradition because of these Rashayim who are doing all this criminal stuff, right? It's just never been... that's never been...
Reading Buber assured you there was a place for you and how you thought inside the umbrella.
That's right. I have many doubts, but not about that. So I would say that's a pretty profound impact.